I went to medical school when I was 18, and since then I've studied easily over 10,000 hours. Yes, that is a lot of studying. And the majority of that time was spent on revision and review. I used everything from spaced repetition and active recall with flashcards to practice questions, summary pages, brain dumps. But I finally discovered one of the most powerful techniques of all, and it's called interleaving. In this video, I'm going to tell you exactly how you can use interleaving to upgrade your revision and become a more efficient learner. By the way, when I say the word revision, I'm talking about going over material and reviewing stuff that you've already studied before. I know some other countries use different words. I'll start off by telling you what interleaving is and how to do it. And at the end of the video, I'll give you my 4 rules that you can follow to make sure you are doing interleaving the right way. If you're new to the channel, welcome. I'm Dr. Justin Sung. I'm a full-time learning coach and the head of learning at I Can Study. I'm also a former medical doctor, and I've worked with tens of thousands of students from around the world to help them learn more efficiently. Now imagine if there was a single technique that was so effective that it could help you improve your memory, improve your test performance, even help you to learn new concepts that you have never encountered before. Well, that is what interleaving is. So let me explain how it works. Back in high school, I used to be really involved in Taekwondo. It was actually like the first sport that I was ever really good at. Very stereotypical Korean, I know. But we used to do these drills where we kick the paddle. You know, someone's holding a pad and you aim for it and then you kick it. And instead of just practicing kicking the same paddle held at the same distance, the same way every single time, what we'd do is sometimes we'd bring it forward, sometimes we'd bring it closer. And so we would have to adjust on the fly where to aim our kick. And by doing this, it would train my ability to use that kick in any situation. The reason I'm telling you this is because that is actually a form of interleaving. And the concept is very similar for studying. Interleaving is when you learn something by mixing different concepts and different facts, different angles and variations while you learn something, instead of doing what's called blocked practice, which is where you would just start with one concept and you learn it fully before moving on to the next one. Blocked practice for practicing a kick would be holding it in the exact same place every single time until I've mastered it, and then moving it higher, moving it lower, forward, back. For something like basketball, it would be standing on the free throw line, practicing shooting it from that exact same spot every single time until you've mastered it. But with interleaving, that's when we're changing things up. We're moving it forward, we're moving it back, we're standing in front of the line, we're standing a little bit behind the line, left of the line, right of the line, and we're giving ourselves variations of the same concept. And so for studying, it's about looking at a concept from multiple different perspectives to help understand it, rather than trying to understand it through just one perspective first. For example, let's say that I'm learning about the effect of British colonialism on India. The blocked method of learning, which by the way is the most common way that people use, would be to learn about each effect one by one. An interleave method would be to take all of the different effects, try and generally understand one of them, then move on to another effect and compare and contrast them to find similarities and differences. And then we do the same thing for another effect and we look for similarities and differences. And then after we've done 3 different effects, we might move back to the first one and learn that one a little bit more deeply, and then again compare and contrast that with the second one and the third one, and that cycle continues until we've learned everything. If I'm learning something more technical like the physiology of how a muscle contracts, a blocked method would be to learn the physiology and just learn that process until I feel like I've completely understood it. And then maybe a week later during a revision session, I'm gonna test myself with some practice questions and flashcards. In that method, we're looking at one concept from one perspective until we feel like we've fully mastered it. Using interleaving would mean that I learn how the muscle contracts in a normal situation, and then I compare that with how it is in a disease situation, and then maybe how I would treat that diseased muscle. Later, when I go to test myself and review it, I'm going to be focusing on comparing and contrasting the differences between those situations. See, now it's the same process, but we're looking at that process from multiple angles. The process of normal versus disease versus treating that disease and trying to get it back to normal. And that comparing and contrasting is where the value seems to be. Interleaving is helpful because by giving yourself variations of a concept, it helps your brain form a better picture of what the concept is versus what it is not. It pushes your brain to pay attention to the parts of the information that make it characteristic and sticky. I sort of think of it like trying to understand what a place looks like by looking at a photo of it for a really long time versus being able to visit the actual place and explore and look around. Seeing something from multiple angles helps you understand each of those angles much more easily and more quickly and more memorably. And speaking of which, if you found that this is an angle on learning that you found helpful, then I'd appreciate if you give this video a like. Every like helps with the algorithm, which helps me make more content for free. Now, this interleave method is really different to how I used to study when I was in my early years of uni. I used to have these really big revision days where I'd sit down once a week for like 6 or 7 hours and try to get through as much of one paper as possible. And I used to create these huge summary pages and brain dumps on like the whole week or fortnight's worth of lectures. And at the end of the session, I'd have this beautiful summary page, like perfectly, all the headings and completely organized and the nice tables and everything. Sometimes I'd even print them out and like create my own little like mini textbook. But fast forward a few weeks and I'm looking at these pages wondering where all the knowledge went. And even though I knew I had a good basic understanding of all the facts, I had good fact recall, I was confident in that knowledge, I knew that when I walked into the exam, there would still be some questions that I'm going to get wrong, that I cannot answer. There's an angle that I have not considered and I have not looked at, and I don't know what it is, but it's like a fact of the universe. There's going to be something that I get wrong. Now, the reason interleaving is relevant here is because interleaving actually directly helps to protect you against those tricky curveball questions by helping you see more of those angles that you otherwise may have missed. And it is incredibly effective. There's a lot of ongoing research on interleaving. Researchers still don't exactly know what interleaving is and exactly how it works. Based on the pace of the research, it's probably going to be at least another 10 years before we know that. A recent systematic review and meta-analysis on interleaving found a Hedges G value of effect size at 0.65 for memory improvement and transfer. Transfer is what we call your ability to take what you've already learned and use that to learn new things that you haven't encountered before. And a value of 0.65 is considered moderately strong. And you might be thinking, moderately strong doesn't sound that impressive, but you would be wrong. Learning is really complicated and there are a lot of things that influence your learning. There are very, very few techniques where a single technique is able to have that level of impact. For reference, some studies have found that just writing notes, the general idea of writing notes, only has an effect size of around 0.5. And simply rereading and rewriting notes has an effect size of around 0.2 to 0.3. Even spacing combined with free active recall, which is where you review something and then you wait a little while and then you review it again from memory, which is considered one of the most effective strategies that's ever been found. It is like the only strategy that people swear by on YouTube. And it is the underlying concept that basically all flashcard apps are built around, has an effect size hovering at around 0.8, which is not that much greater than interleaving. So if you were to combine spaced active recall with interleaving, you are going to have a noticeable and probably significant improvement in your ability to learn new information. Now, unfortunately, unlike spacing and active recall, where there's a lot of research and we generally know when it works and when it doesn't work, interleaving is something that we are still not really sure about. We don't know exactly what you need to do to make it perfectly effective. And we do know that in some situations when you do it wrong, there is literally no effect, and in some cases, just because it's wasting time, it's more harmful. But I've been using this method for several years now, and I've also been teaching this to tens of thousands of students. So I've had the chance to see what works and what doesn't. And so here are my rules for using interleaving to make it as effective as it can be. Number one, make yourself compare and contrast. If the way you're doing interleaving is not actually helping you compare and contrast variations of different concepts and figure out exactly what a concept is versus what a concept is not, then it's probably not going to help you. And to do this, you're going to want to test yourself in different ways. Use a multitude of different techniques to test your knowledge. You do want to test your memory repeatedly, but you do not want to repeatedly use the same method to test your memory. Every time you have a revision session, use a different technique that helps you explore the concept from a different angle to explore new perspectives. I have many other videos talking about different methods of revision that all can be plugged into this, and I will continue to upload more videos talking about different methods moving into the future. So if you haven't already, that's a reason that maybe you should subscribe. Number 2, look for variations rather than totally new concepts. You can't just take 2 random topics and mash them together and call that interleaving. The different concepts or facts or angles that you are cycling between have to be similar enough that there is similarities between them, but different enough that you can actually distinguish them apart. For example, in biology, mitosis and meiosis are 2 different types of cell division, and those 2 would be good concepts that you can interleave between because there's a lot of similarities, but there are also very distinct differences between the 2 to tell them apart. However, if you were to compare mitosis with photosynthesis, that probably is not going to be very useful because they're very, very different and the similarities are very general and abstract. On the other hand, let's say that you were studying some kind of legal policy and you're interleaving between policy A and policy B, and the 2 of them are so similar that even when you're comparing them side by side, it's hard to know which is which. In this situation, it's very hard to actually spot the differences and tell them apart, and that can actually just add confusion. So that would be a situation that is too similar for there to be effective interleaving. You're not always going to be able to find a way to interleave literally every single concept that you learn, but what I found is that for most topics, every concept can be looked at least from another angle, or is related to another concept within that same topic very closely. And I think by virtue of it being within the same topic, there are not many situations where you've got a concept that you literally cannot compare and contrast with anything else because it is just so isolated and removed from every other concept. Rule number 3, try to force these compare and contrast interleaving opportunities frequently. Don't spend one day studying a concept and then another day studying the variation and try to compare and contrast. The research says that the benefit of interleaving seems to fade when the gap between interleaving sessions grows further apart. It's also much more confusing and overwhelming because now you have to compare and contrast and look for similarities and differences between a whole day's worth of studying and another whole day's worth of studying. It is much easier, practical, less overwhelming, and actually just more beneficial to compare and contrast ideas every 10 to 15 minutes. You should take a single example, single variation, single concept that is fresh in your memory and immediately compare and contrast that to its variation or other related concept. Again, you want to avoid learning too much before you compare and contrast because that's going to create a lot of overwhelm and confusion. And that ties in directly with number 4, which is to build your knowledge over time. Interleaving is very effective, but when you study with a lot of interleaving, you will find that you're not feeling your knowledge growing as quickly as you may have felt with your previous technique. This is because when we're interleaving, we're building our knowledge like filling a bathtub rather than filling a test tube. When we learn one thing very narrow, very deep, and completely understand it before moving on, we can feel like our knowledge is growing very quickly because we can see our knowledge level rising very quickly. But this is actually an illusion of confidence because that knowledge is very fragile and not well supported by anything around it. So it's more likely to fade, we're more likely to have errors, and we're more likely to get back to a week later and realize we've forgotten half of it. But when we learn with interleaving, and most of the other strategies also that I talk about in my other videos, it creates knowledge like filling a bathtub. Even if you've got the water on full blast, you don't really see the water level rising very quickly, even though the actual volume that is being filled is much more substantial. When you apply these cycles of interleaving, where each cycle is more in-depth and more detailed, you will feel that your knowledge improves every cycle rather than every individual concept. And I promise, trust me, by the end of the day, when you've done 3 or 4 cycles, you will feel that your knowledge is much more stable and much more robustly understood than you would have felt with your previous method of studying. Now, just as a disclaimer, even if you do all this and then you follow all these rules and you're perfect with interleaving, interleaving and retrieval are still just one side of the coin. You still need high quality encoding to make sure that you've encoded the information into your memory properly in the first place. And that is actually probably the biggest bottleneck for most students. The learning system of an efficient learner should have both high quality encoding and high quality retrieval with interleaving. Now, if you would like to know how good your learning system is, then I've actually created a quiz that you can do for free. There's a link in the description. You answer a bunch of questions that tells you what your strengths and weaknesses are. And also leave a few links in the description about videos to do with different retrieval and revision strategies that you might want to plug into your interleaving straight away. Let me know how you get along. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you next time.